Thank you and welcome everyone. My name is Gareth Lloyd and I'm going to chair this session. I'm General Manager Corporate Affairs for the Global CCS Institute. This is one of a series of webinars involving leading speakers and organisations from around the world. We're delighted to introduce you to David Merkin, who's Business Development Director of the Co2 project. He's going to talk about the business case for CCS in the power industry, a case study of the Don Valley Power Project. And a little background on David. David Merkin is the Co2 Energy's Business Development Director. He joined the company in 2010. He's responsible for developing Co2's business opportunities around the North Sea and internationally. As part of the Don Valley Power Project team, David's responsibilities covers building the business case, financing negotiations with partners, governments and economic analysis. A little bit of background. From 2007 to 2010, David worked as a CCS business developer for BP Hydrogen Power and for BP's Hydrogen Energy joint venture with Rio Tinto. During that time he supported a number of business opportunities in Europe, North America, the Middle East and Australia, supporting major projects in Abu Dhabi, California, while building expertise in commercial and financial aspects of the CCS business case. David's originally from New Zealand and moved to the UK after completing a degree in politics and economics in Wellington in 2002. It's my pleasure to introduce David to you, but just before we go into that, you'll have seen the little box on the right hand side of your screen, and just a couple of housekeeping points to make sure that this all runs efficiently and you're able to ask the questions that you want to ask. What we will do is ask David to run the presentation, and we'll go through all of that, but you're encouraged to write your questions as we go into the little box you'll see on the right. I, as your chairman, will pose these questions to the presenter after the presentation, so please submit your questions directly into the Co2 webinar control panel. What I will do is sometimes combine questions where we get two that are very similar, and that's just in the interests in terms of efficient use of time. So I hope that's all clear. I'm now going to hand over to David Merkin, who's going to take you through the presentation. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Gareth, for that great introduction, and everybody, thanks for joining us today. It's Monday morning here in the UK. I imagine for many of you it's already Monday evening, so we'll try and get through this as efficiently as possible, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have at the end of the presentation. As Gareth mentioned a little bit earlier, my name is David Merkin and I'm Business Development Director for Co2 Energy. Co2 Energy is a privately owned CCS development company. We were founded in 2010 by senior people from Denbury, Hydrogen Energy and TPG. Starting with Denbury, Denbury's one of the largest CO2 Enhanced Oil Recovery companies in the world. They have more than 1,000 miles of pipelines in the United States, and they currently move more than 20 million tonnes a year of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And our chairman, Gareth Roberts, was the founder, former CEO of Denbury Resources. Many of us come from Hydrogen Energy, which was a BP Rio Tinto joint venture, which developed 3 CCS projects around the world. Our CEO, Lewis Gillies, was the CEO of Hydrogen Energy, and that's where I'm from as well. And financially we're backed by TPG, which is one of the world's largest private equity firms. And Co2's largest single project is in the UK, and it's called the Don Valley Power Project. This slide here is a brief summary of the project, and you'll be able to see this in more detail if you wish to access the slides after the presentation. It's approximately 650 megawatt net project located at Stainforth in Yorkshire, which is on the east coast of England, and is planned to be constructed over 3 years. Will consume approximately 2 million tonnes a year of local coal and send approximately 5 million tonnes a year of CO2 offshore, first through a 90-kilometre long onshore pipeline and then a 300-kilometre long offshore pipeline to the central North Sea. It's part of the Yorkshire Humber CCS cluster, which includes most notably another CCS project, the White Rose project at Drax, also several other industrial emitters in the region. The project is designed to use the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, and we expect the 5 million tonnes per year of CO2 to generate approximately 100 million barrels of oil over 20 years. So moving on to the context of this presentation and of the report that we wrote late last year on looking at the business case for Don Valley Power Plant and how we put that together. Now, when we started out with Don Valley, which we acquired off the previous owners in 2010, we looked at other business cases developed by other projects around the world. And the Global CCS Institute has actually published several of these already, and they can all be found on the Institute's website. In particular, 3 large projects in North America published business cases. The TransAlta project in Alberta in Canada, the Trailblazer project in Texas, and AEP's Mountaineer project in the Appalachian Mountains. In Europe, ROAD, the Rotterdam Carbon Capture and Storage project, published a business case study, as has the Rotterdam Climate Initiative. And all of these reports are very interesting, and they can all be found on the website. In addition, of course, the Global CCS Institute's annual survey is published. That's in the annual status of CCS report, and that also contains very interesting information about what the CCS community as a whole considers as important in a business case. So first of all, we reviewed all these business cases to see what other projects considered to be most important for their business cases. And this slide just shows collectively what was considered most important. Far and away most important is considered to be a capital grant, so money from a government that would directly reduce the capital costs of building a carbon capture and storage facility. Other major items of importance, EOR revenue, enhanced oil revenue, or utilising the CO2 that's captured to produce extra oil. The revenue produced by that oil can then be offset against the extra costs of CCS. Also considered very important, CO2 emission price. So having a price on emissions of CO2 to provide an incentive to capture it. Of course, in many parts of the world, the emission price for CO2 is probably too low to pose a significant incentive at present. Other items here include government-backed lending, so that's loans provided to projects by governments that then reduce the requirement to get funding from elsewhere. And another major one, a premium power price. So the ability for a project to charge a higher price for the electricity generated than a standard thermal power plant or a standard power plant, and using that extra revenue from a premium power price to offset the higher costs of carbon capture and storage. There's a range of other important items there that were mentioned by just one project. You can see those on this slide there. So let's now assess the context, the market context that Don Valley Power Plant sits in, and see how it compares against other parts of the world for those elements considered important. Now, we believe that the UK market is attractive for CCS, and this screen illustrates why we think that is the case. It's the UK government, clear UK government policy to decarbonise the power sector by 2050, and as part of that the government's planned to introduce a power premium for CCS electricity in order to incentivise it to be built. They've also provided for a system of capital grants. At the moment there's £1 billion available for up to 2 projects in the UK to help them be built, and unlike several European countries, there's many storage opportunities, including opportunities for enhanced oil recovery. Offsetting those attractions, the fact that there's quite a lot of competition, several projects competing for government support. The storage is potentially challenged by cost because it's offshore. In many cases it's a significant distance offshore, requiring large transport infrastructure to be built. And the regulatory requirements for storage in Europe potentially pose a question of significant cost as well. And although the government signalled its intent to introduce a power premium for CCS and has outlined the broad mechanism by which it thinks it will work, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, the exact nature of the support is still unclear, and the rules and laws required haven't yet been passed by government. And complicating this for Don Valley in particular is that it wasn't successful in the competition to get access to those capital grants. The competition started last year, and Don Valley was deselected from that process at the end of last year. And I'll get back to that again a bit later in the presentation as well. So this slide briefly describes how the UK government plans on providing the power premium to carbon capture and storage projects, and it considers that this will be the primary mechanism by which projects can be made to work in the UK. The UK has a deregulated power system, and the wholesale power price is set daily on exchanges, and it fluctuates from day to day and from year to year. And what government envisages is applying what's called a feed-in tariff contract for difference. And this will be set at a certain price for electricity that will enable a CCS project to meet its costs for CCS, and it will be fixed at a flat rate. If the rate is higher in the prevailing wholesale power price in the market, then the CCS project will be paid money from the counterpart that manages the process. If the wholesale power price rises above the level at which the feed-in tariff is set, then the project will pay money back to the counterpart. And this is designed to ensure that the project gets a reliable source of power revenue, while at the same time preventing against the potential for windfall gains in revenue if the wholesale power price is higher than people expect. So alongside this potential for a premium power price in the UK is the potential for enhanced oil recovery. Now often people are surprised to hear that in the UK enhanced oil recovery is an option, but actually it's been considered for several years. The first study looking at CO2 enhanced oil recovery was undertaken in 1979. Numerous studies have been conducted since then, and all have indicated that the technology is technically attractive. The geology of the reservoirs in the North Sea is sufficiently similar enough to those that have been successfully developed in North America for us to be confident that they can be utilised for EOR in the North Sea as well. Other types of enhanced oil recovery have been successfully deployed at scale in the North Sea. In particular, BP has a very large natural gas EOR project at the Magnus field in the North Sea, and that is very similar technically to a CO2 EOR project. And of course CO2 storage has itself been successfully deployed in the North Sea, both at Sleipner for 15 years now in the Norwegian North Sea, and for the past 3 or 4 years at Snøhvit as well in the Norwegian North Sea. And then finally, back in 2006, BP, Shell and ConocoPhillips developed the Miller field to the point of final investment decision, and that was going to be a CO2 EOR project. The only reason that project didn't proceed was lack of availability of CO2 to undertake the EOR. That was relating to earlier CCS project at Peterhead in Scotland. So the way we look at it is that successful development of CO2 EOR is a question of cost and CO2 availability, but not one of technology. So the potential for EOR combines with the prospect of a premium power price in the UK to make it an attractive location to develop CCS projects. Having established that the UK is a great place to build CCS projects, we next looked at addressing our funding requirement. Now, CCS is a very expensive technology to deploy, especially at large scale, and the Don Valley Power Plant being 650 megawatts or 900 megawatts gross is one of the largest out there. Approximately £5 billion of capital cost across the value chain. That's power generation, carbon capture, transportation and storage. On the left-hand side of the slide you can see roughly how that's divided. In our business model, transport doesn't form part of the capital cost. It is built by a third party and then is charged through to the project as a transportation tariff. So of that capital cost, roughly 2/3 is in the power plant and capture facilities, and the balance is in storage and in financing costs. Financing costs there comprise fees and interest accrued during construction. And of that power plant, 2/3, again about 60% is related to the CCS equipment, about a quarter to the non-CCS equipment, and 7% to other parts of the power plant. The CCS component there is large as a share of capital cost because the project is planned as an integrated gasifier combined cycle project, and the gasification equipment therefore is a CCS component, and it's the most capital intensive part of the plant. And again, financing costs make up a component there of the cost of the power plant. So this is a significant funding challenge to meet. We appointed a team of people, both internally and with banks, to look at how best we could address this financing challenge. And we can meet the funding in 3 different ways: through equity, debt or grants, and each has benefits and drawbacks. The benefit of equity is that it's capital that's able to take risk, and it can be accessed from several potential different sources, and those sources can change depending on what phase of development the project's in. The disadvantage from the perspective of getting the project built and running is that equity requires a high rate of return in order to take on the risks that it takes. Aside equity, there's debt. It's potentially much lower cost than equity, requires a lower rate of return. It's also potentially available on a very large scale to the right projects, but debt providers are unwilling to take risk, and they also require fees that can potentially add significant amounts of cost to a project. Then finally there's capital grants. These are best of all from the perspective of a developer because they reduce both the equity and the debt requirement directly. Several were available to the project in Europe. First is the EPR grant, or the European Energy Project for Recovery, which the project is a recipient of, and that's a grant of 180 million euros. Then there's the New Entrant Reserve 300, and the UK government £1 billion. The New Entrant Reserve 300 was only available to projects that were also in the running for the UK government grant, and because Don Valley wasn't selected for that UK government grant, it also wasn't eligible to get the New Entrant Reserve money either. So of those 3, it's only received EPR grant. Now, we put together our funding package last year before we were deselected from the UK government process. So the funding plan I'm going to show over the next slide or 2 assumes some grant from the UK government, and towards the end of this presentation I'll address the consequences of not receiving that. So this was our proposed funding allocation for the Don Valley Power Project. We expected to get 26% of the total capital cost from grants, 14% would come from equity, and that would mean that the balancing 60% would come from debt sources. Of those debt sources, the vast majority would come from what are called multilateral financial institutions and export credit agencies. Now we identified these sources of debt as good potential for the project because lending decisions are made there in support of objectives that are in addition to the simple commercial objectives that a commercial bank would have. So for example, Export Credit Agency debt was being offered to the project alongside technology that the project is taking from different countries around the world. So technology that's coming from Korea, for example, for the project would also attract a loan from the Korean Exim Bank, which is a export credit agency from Korea. Multilateral financial institutions here include notably the European Investment Bank, and they have an objective to lend money to projects that will support low carbon power development across Europe. And so because they have that objective, they are willing, in theory, to provide funding to carbon capture and storage projects in Europe. So we'd identified that these multilateral financial institutions and export credit agencies provide around about 80% of the debt funding that the project would need, the power plant would need, leaving just a balance of 20% or so to come from commercial sources. And having tested this funding breakdown with the banks, we were optimistic that had we received a sufficient amount of grants, that this funding package would have been achievable for the project. And it was achievable based on the business plan for Don Valley, which, because it was utilising enhanced oil recovery, meant that its costs were somewhat lower than other projects. And specifically in our case, the enhanced oil recovery provided sufficient revenue to the storage part of the value chain that it didn't need to charge a storage fee to the capture project. So it was entirely economically self-sufficient, and that meant that the capture project got storage for free. The transport costs, however, it did have to pay in the economic model. So having established the financing plan, just going to, the next few slides will just show roughly how the revenues and cost profiles looked for the project, starting off with what the power plant was envisaged to produce. It was envisaged to produce about 650 megawatts net of power. That's around about 7 terawatt hours a year, and just under 5 million tonnes a year of CO2. And you can see on this graph here that as the plant starts up, it's less reliable, and particularly the gasifier that produces syngas is less reliable in the startup years, meaning that less CO2 is captured in those startup years. After 3 or 4 years of operation, it gets into a steady state mode where it's running on hydrogen from the gasifier around about 90% of the time. For the balancing time, when the gas turbine is available but the gasifier isn't working, the plant can run on natural gas. That boosts the amount of electricity that it generates. But the electricity generated in that mode can't have CO2 capture applied, and so it doesn't count as low carbon electricity, and therefore doesn't attract the low carbon premium. But by about 3 years into the project, most of the power is coming from low carbon generation, and therefore attracts the power premium. When it's in that steady state operation, this is an approximation of an annual operating cost. Roughly a third of the annual operating cost goes into fuel purchase, both coal and gas. About 20% goes to running the cost of running the air separation unit, which is a large unit that's required to provide the oxygen that provides the low carbon generation, that helps provide the low carbon generation in the project. And around about 20% of the cost is what we call CCS Variable Costs, which is made up mostly the cost of CO2 transportation. You can see there as well, a small component there is the cost for EU ETS allowances. This is the cost to purchase allowances to emit CO2, and the project needs to buy those allowances for the CO2 that isn't captured during its operations. So that's the rough split of operating cost. This next slide shows the breakdown in revenue between the wholesale power price and the feed-in tariff contract for difference. In the early years, when the wholesale power price is lower, the project requires a somewhat higher component from contract for difference. But over time, as the project gets more mature and as the wholesale power price rises over time, the CFD component of the total revenue falls from around about 40% in the early years to around about 27% in later years. The numbers shown here, incidentally, are using the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change's internal long-term forecasts for power price, for coal price, gas price, and for emissions costs. So combining those costs and revenues, this is a simplified cash flow diagram, and you can see the 3 years of CapEx up front, leading to a 20-year project life. In those 20 years, operating cost makes up 2/3, 3/4 of the total, and then the remaining revenue goes towards the operating margin. That operating margin then pays back the debt and the equity that's being put into the project. And just a quick look at the sensitivities that the project has. By some distance, the largest sensitivity that we judged the power project would have is capital cost. And a large swing in capital cost would have a significant impact on the power premium required for the project to be successful. Another interesting one there is the startup delay. If construction took a year longer than forecast, then the power price would once again need to be significantly higher in order for us to pay back our debt and pay back our equity to the rates of return that they require. Other sensitivities are also important, but they're less of less relative magnitude than CapEx and startup delay. There's been a lot of news recently about how to reduce the cost of carbon capture and storage, and as part of our funding study we investigated how Don Valley could contribute to this, and this is a slide that I'll briefly cover what we considered were ways that Don Valley could reduce the cost of CCS in future. The interesting thing I think about this slide is that assuming future developments in carbon capture and storage technology make up only a very small part of how we think Don Valley could contribute to lower costs in future. It's the right-hand most of these 5 elements. Much more important, what we considered potentially here, is items like EOR taxes. So as CO2 EOR gets developed, then and the oil starts getting produced, the EOR facility will start making profits and will start paying taxes back to government. Now in the UK, offshore taxes are between 62 and 81%. So the vast majority of the profitability of an offshore enhanced oil recovery project in the UK will go to government and not to the project developer. And this effectively reduces the net cost to government and to society of demonstrating CCS before anything else happens. Then the cost of installing the pipeline infrastructure could be reused by other projects. In our case, in the Yorkshire cluster, the pipeline is designed to be significantly larger than required by just one project, so it won't require significant amounts of extra investment to take additional volumes of CO2 from other sources. And then thirdly, building the know-how and expertise in the UK to develop these projects will greatly reduce the difficulty and challenge of developing the mix, and in particular it may improve the willingness of equity and debt providers to support follow-on projects, and therefore reduce the rate of return required by future projects, which will reduce the cost of future projects in terms of the electricity price that they need to go ahead. Combining these elements, we believe that a successful project would reduce the cost of the next project by between £30 and £60 a megawatt hour. As I mentioned, assuming a reduction in the cost of technology for CCS would be only a small fraction of that benefit. We put together a detailed risk management plan, and this slide just shows from a business perspective what we consider to be the most important risks across the whole value chain. A couple of slides ago we saw the key sensitivities for the power plant, and CapEx being the largest one there. You can see on this slide that CapEx is one of the largest risks in terms of impact on rate of return, and also in terms of its difficulty to mitigate. The element in an enhanced oil recovery project that has most impact on IRR is oil price. If oil price is drastically different to what you expect, it can have a huge impact on our rate of return. And as a single project, it's essentially impossible to mitigate. You can hedge, but that only provides short-term mitigation of that risk. You can just see here another series of risks and how we assessed they were in terms of difficulty of mitigation and their impact, and also their likelihood of occurring. One of the largest impact on IRR risks there is one called competitive funding. You know, and this is taken to mean if grant isn't available, then that makes it much more difficult for the project to proceed. And Don Valley duly didn't receive the grant that it applied for. So what impact does that have going forward? Well, first of all, let's just go back to the beginning and compare Don Valley against what other projects considered to be important in the CCS business case. Most important, of course, capital grant, which Don Valley doesn't have a large one for construction. For those other important elements of success, Don Valley has them in place. EOR revenue is there. There's a CO2 emission price in the UK, not only the European Union scheme, but a carbon price floor in the UK that makes the cost of carbon higher than it otherwise will be. We do have access to government-backed lending in the project through multilateral financial institutions and export credit agencies, and we have access to the premium power price through the feed-in tariff contract for difference. In terms of all the other items that were mentioned, Don Valley also possesses all of those. Tax incentives is one with a question mark over it. It is expected that tax incentives will be made available to enhanced oil recovery projects in the North Sea in order to encourage their development. This is expected to be the case because the UK government has put in place tax incentives for other types of unconventional oil and gas development in the North Sea. So if these are the elements of project success, and Don Valley has all of them except for the capital grant, then what are the next steps for Don Valley? Without that capital grant, it's very challenged to proceed. And before it can proceed, TUCO needs to readdress the size of the project and its capital cost, where that capital cost is going to come from, and the revenue profile that will make sense for the project. And in particular, when we're looking at readdressing the size of the capital cost, we're looking at whether we should be making the plant smaller, which may raise the per unit cost, but will decrease the absolute cost of the project and therefore decrease the total financing requirement. We're also looking at phasing the project so that we could build one half initially and then the balance later on. If we can get the project to the right size and the right capital profile and the right funding plan, that means that it can go ahead. We strongly believe that the prospects for enhanced oil recovery and the premium power price available in the UK mean that it's got an excellent prospect for success in the longer term. While we work to re-examine the project and make it robust to its changed circumstances, we're continuing to complete technical definition on the project and certain commercial terms and conditions that we need to have in place. And those will reduce our risks until the circumstances are right and the funding is in place and the project can be built. Well, that concludes the presentation. I expect there's a few questions to answer, so over to you, Gareth.
Thank you, David. Thank you for what was a very clear presentation on a complex area. So now's the opportunity for me to put your questions to David. And a quick reminder, put them in that right-hand box, and I'll do my best to go through those in the time. Do please remember that all these resources, the presentation which is recorded, and the report which is currently on the website, the presentation will be there in a couple of days' time. But to kick off, I'd like a question to David from Saoirse Schnittinger, and that is, could you please, David, clarify if the $5 billion in CapEx did not include any cost of transport?
That's right. The £5 billion. The £5 billion did not include any cost in transport. That's right, including financing. It was the capture facility, the IGCC, the Integrated Gasification Combined Cycle, and the EOR project. The transportation cost is given the size of the total capital cost for those elements of the chain. The transportation cost is actually a small fraction of the $5 billion. So it's not a significant amount more than that.
And another question from Saoirse, what was the envisaged arrangement or perceived benefit of leasing the pipeline from a third party, and do you think this could be a good model UK-wide?
There are several reasons why we consider it a good idea to lease the pipeline from a third party. The third party developing the pipeline is National Grid, and they own and operate the UK's high pressure gas distribution network as well as its electricity distribution network. They're experts in the manner and pipeline transportation, and we considered that they had a core competency that would enable them to deliver that system better. Also, the nature of their organisation and their funding means that a pipeline infrastructure type piece of equipment would be more easily funded, we believe, by their shareholders and by their company, and that it would deliver a optimum solution for a cluster. Now, that several aspects of that relate solely to the UK, in particular to the fact that National Grid is already operates the gas distribution network in the UK. If that wasn't the case, we may have considered a different way to develop the project. But if circumstances were similar in other parts of the world, I would imagine that it would also be a useful way to develop CCS projects.
Thanks for that. And then coming on to storage capacity in the North Sea from David Winder, do we have any idea what the total storage capacity in the North Sea fields may be? So can you give us throw some light on that?
In terms of total storage capacity, several studies have been undertaken, and across both saline and depleted oil and gas reservoirs, it's estimated that there's several tens of gigatons of CO2 storage, and that's in the UK sector alone. Of course, and even saline alone in the southern North Sea, potentially tens of gigatons of CO2 storage. So there's no theoretical shortage of storage. Of course, when you start to look at sites in more detail, they often become more challenging. Individual sites become more challenging. And that's particularly the case, well, it's not particularly the case, but it is certainly the case with enhanced oil recovery. And it's not necessarily to do with the geology or the storage capacity of the field. It could be to do with the fact that the oil field is still on plateau production and therefore can't usefully use CO2 for several more years. Or it could be that the platform that's been used to produce the oil is so old and needs so much maintenance that you may need to build an entirely new platform if you want to do CO2 enhanced oil recovery. So there's numerous complicating factors once you get to an individual storage site, but in theory, the general consensus is tens of gigatons of storage available.
Sure. And then another one in terms of the specifics you got into, Don Valley and funding programs, and that's from Alan Matheson. Why do you think Don Valley was not selected under the UK CCS commercialisation programme?
We are restricted by the Department of Energy in saying in discussing the negotiations and the outcomes of the competition, and in line with the kind of the attendee list here, I think I'm going to have to be reasonably quiet on that matter.
Sure.
All I'd simply say is the UK government had a series of preferred metrics for CCS plants, and other projects that were in the competition achieved better on those metrics.
Yeah. Okay. No, we do understand that. And just while, in case we get some other questions, just one from me. You've talked a lot about the advantages of the EOR in terms of balancing the equation. Do you see that? Is there any more recent information on that? Because obviously, when you started your project, you've made some assumptions based on experience in the North Sea. Just wanted if you wanted to add anything in terms of the contribution that EOR is making.
Well, there's no plans. So with our project deselected from the competition, neither of the projects still remaining in the competition plan to use their CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, at least in the first stage. Nor do any of the other projects, as far as I'm aware, currently at an advanced stage around Europe. So demonstration of CO2 EOR in the North Sea at this stage still depend on Don Valley going ahead. But certainly the economic and technical attractiveness of enhanced oil recovery in the North Sea hasn't gone away. And there's still several parties out there, in addition to ourselves, who are eager and waiting for the CO2 to be made available. And once it's available, then I suspect we'll see a lot of progress there.
Okay, and another question here. This is on storage. Will you be responsible for monitoring of the storage site at all? If so, who will be responsible for monitoring after 20 years of business? From Karin Barber. Yes,
that's right. So the UK, again, Department of Energy and Climate Change has published rules and regulations governing operation of a CO2 storage site, and those rules specify that the operator of the site will be in charge of the storage, and then for monitoring for the first 20 years. And there's a series of requirements around that, including providing a significant amount of funding in reserve, funds in reserve, in case of unexpected events. During that period, incidentally, the Department of Energy and Climate Change retains the authority to withdraw a license to operate as a CO2 storage site and take over operations itself. After the 20 years, then the site is taken over by the Department of Energy and Climate Change and returned to government.
Okay, and from Stephen Corley, how much might OPEX be reduced by using cheap coal imported from the US, displaced by shale gas? Could that be more than the 10% in the sensitivity analysis?
It could indeed be, Steve. The coal price assumption used in here is DEC's long-term coal forecast, which is substantially above current costs for coal. Of course, who knows whether the availability of cheap coal from the US will be in the long term. But yes, it's in the order of more than 30% reduction in coal price compared with what's shown in the numbers there.
And follow on from Stephen on funding. If the Peterhead Goldeneye project gets the UK £1 billion and not the White Rose project, what are the prospects of Don Valley progressing? Bit of a hard one, I guess.
It is a bit of a hard one. We are working to make sure that Don Valley could go ahead with or without White Rose going ahead. Obviously with White Rose going ahead at the same time, the cluster benefits will start coming through. But we're working to make Don Valley stand on its own if needs be, as we've always done. That may create a challenge for where we go and what we choose to do with the CO2 in terms of storage and EOR development plan. But I suspect we could still make it go ahead without White Rose as long as the funding package is correct.
Okay. Look, and we don't have any more questions, so what I'll do is draw to a close, and I'd like to thank on everyone's behalf you, David, for handling the presentation so well and the clarity around it. What I will say is that we're happy to take further questions in terms of feedback, and we'll pass those on and try to answer them as best we can. This is recorded and it will be on our website in a couple of days' time. The report itself is actually already on the website. We always welcome your feedback. We try to attract leading speakers from around the world, and I think this has been a good example. What I'd encourage you to do is give us general feedback as well in terms of topics that you would like covered. Hopefully this has been very useful to you, so please feed through feedback. I'd like to thank you again for your questions and draw this to a close and say thank you to everyone involved, and thank you for attending this webinar from the Global CCS Institute. Thank you.